Okay. Well, welcome back, folks. We are doing Ozarks history, and we've been talking about the early settlement of the Ozarks by the Americans. And today we're going to get into how Missouri became a state. Pretty interesting story because unlike most states, it was quite controversial and took a long time. Seems like nothing is easy for us Missourians. I don't know if you've noticed that or not. Um, I told Rachel, I hope I don't lose signal. We're having quite a little thunderstorm outside right now, which is kind of unusual. We haven't had very much rain this summer. So I'm glad to see it. I just wish it wouldn't have come in the middle of my presentation. So I always start with uh, talking about a famous Ozarker, famous Missourian. Now, you might imagine that this is obviously somebody in the 1800s, since it's a painting. And you might even probably surmise, looking at it real carefully, that he's probably a painter himself, which is exactly what he is. He was one of the foremost painters of the 19th century and homegrown Missourian, very well known, painted tons of paintings, all reflecting the culture and society of Missouri, particularly the era of the Civil War. Did some controversial things during the Civil War, and we'll talk about that when we get into the Civil War. But his name is George Caleb Bingham, very famous artist, Hudson River Valley School artist, and came west and settled into Missouri, and just really a prolific artist that captured a lot of early Missouri in his paintings. So that's our famous Missourian Ozarker today. So let's get into the statehood, how Missouri became a state. Now, the admission of Missouri into the Union was really complex, and it got really contentious because of the fact that there was a nationwide issue involved. And of course, you might imagine that that issue had to do with slavery. So within a few short years after purchasing the Louisiana Territory, the territory of Missouri had been carved out. That happened really rapidly. They carved out what was called the Missouri Territory. However, the Missouri Territory residents, they weren't very satisfied with the whole situation because they wanted to be part of the Union. They felt like they should be part of the United States really rapidly. One of the reasons was the population of Missouri just grew astronomically. Remember, when the Louisiana Purchase took place, there were not very many people in what we would now know as the state of Missouri. By 1820, folks, there were over 66,000 people in the state of Missouri. That was one of the most rapid expansions of any state in the history of the United States. There was 144,000 by 1830. There was over 380,000 by 1840 and almost 700,000 by 1850. And by the time of the Civil War, there was well over 1 million people in the state of Missouri. I mean, Missouri just was one of the fastest growing areas in the United States during the early 1800s. St. Louis was the fourth largest city in America at one point in time during this period of time. So, Missouri really grew rapidly. And the Missouri people kind of felt like they were kind of being, set back a little bit. They couldn't figure out why they weren't being allowed to become a state a lot sooner than what they were. Now, another problem with all this was the fact that the territorial government, which had been set up, was headed by some people that weren't very good. The first one was a man by the name of James Wilkinson, and I referred to him last week, I believe, when I talked about Aaron Burr and James Wilkinson trying to set up a kind of a carve out their own little nation. And he was actually the head of the Missouri Territory for a little bit. And he was actually kind of a traitor to the country. And luckily, he didn't last very long. And then William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition became the Missouri Territorial Governor. Well, folks, he was a great explorer. He was not very good as a governor. Let's put it that way. He was just not a very good administrator. The result was the people of the territory of Missouri felt like they were just really being handled very poorly. Finally, by 1818, we had reached a population threshold that was required by the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had set up a population threshold where you had to have at least 60,000 people in the state in order to request statehood, and we had far surpassed that. And so they submitted a petition asking Congress to let them in to the United States as a state. This would have been one of the very first states west of the Mississippi River to be admitted into the statehood. Here's the problem. Missouri was a slave state. Now, not everybody in Missouri had slaves. In fact, I would probably surmise that most of the people in Missouri did not have slaves, but it still was a slave state. And the slave owners, the people that owned slaves, were the ones that had the money. The people that had the money ran the government. You know how things haven't changed, have they? And so the slave owners kind of controlled the government, the territorial government at this time. The problem was that people did not like this back east because, the Northwest Ordinance had been passed, which forbids slavery into the Northwest Ordinances. Most of the states in New England and that area had already started outlawing slavery. There wasn't a lot of slave states north of what we now know as the Mason-Dixon line. The result was that there was a huge debate about whether or not to let Missouri in because of the fact that it was a slave state. Also, the fact that the Congress was kind of balanced. There was a certain number of slave states, a certain number of free states, and they didn't want to let the slave states have more involved because they thought if they did that, then, they would control the situation. So here's what happened. They submit a petition in 1818. It was debated in the United States Congress, and it was immediately amended by a congressman from New York who was an absolute staunch abolitionist. And he put an amendment on the petition that said that it had to forbid slavery in order to be admitted to a state. Well, he really didn't have all that much support. But the problem was he was able to debate it and able to stall it until Congress adjourned for the year. So the result was the first petition of the state of Missouri went nowhere in 1818 because they were able to kind of just stall it out. The abolitionists were. So the next year, they filed a second petition. By this time, the people in Missouri begin to figure out, hey, something's going to happen here. And the people that wanted Missouri to come in thought, oh, hey, here's what we'll do. We'll carve out Maine as a state, and it'll come in as a free state, and Missouri can come in as a slave state, and that way it'll balance each other out. It won't upset the equilibrium that they had going. That sounded like a good compromise. Unfortunately, the abolitionists in New England, in that area, they were not going to be a part of this. They absolutely were adamant that Missouri was not going to come in as a slave state. So they again began all sorts of political maneuvers and tactics to stall the petition so Missouri could not come into the Union. The problem is this: they immediately let Maine in as a free state. I mean, there was no debate about Maine. Maine just got immediately in. So Maine's admitted in as a free state, and Missouri is once again put on the back burner. By this time, the Missourians are not happy. As you might imagine, they are really upset because they feel like they're being slapped down by the United States government, and they feel like they're not being treated fairly at all. Of course, this all led to further friction between the abolitionists and the pro-slavery forces in the government. So here's a painting of Representative Talmadge, the man that kind of was responsible for keeping Missouri out of the Union for a couple of attempts. So 1820 rolls around. Now, by this time, the people that were wanting Missouri to come into the Union kind of got their act together, and they thought, okay, we got to get this done, because, if we don't get this done, we don't know what's going to happen. There had already been this kind of aborted attempt by Wilkinson 15 years before or so to kind of carve out a new country. And I guarantee you the people in Missouri were not feeling very happy at this point. And they were kind of concerned about what was going to, all the turmoil that might erupt out in the new territory of Missouri. So there was a lot of people that were determined at this point that they were going to let Missouri in. They knew, though, they had to strike some kind of compromise with the abolitionists, so the abolitionists would go along with it. So that's what happened. They struck a compromise which would determine the future admission of states into the Union clear up until 1852. So Missouri admission into the Union had a great impact upon how other states were going to be admitted for the next 30 years or so. So it's called the Missouri Compromise, and I'm sure you've all heard of it in one way or the other. You might remember it from your history and you might not. But what it said was that all states, future states, north of the 3630-degree line, which is basically the southern edge of Missouri, would be admitted into the Union as free states. Those states south would be admitted as slave states. Now, the reason the abolitionists went along with this was because at that point in time, they really didn't think that there was going to be that many states carved out of the old Mexican territory and all like that. Remember, this was still controlled by Mexico. That was part of the Mexican government at this point. So they weren't really too concerned about this. They thought that this was really an advantage to the abolitionists. On top of that, the compromise stressed that Missouri had the choice to come in as a slave state or a free state. This was a doctrine known as popular sovereignty. I'm sorry, folks. That's a hard word for me to say. I've never been able to say that word very well. It's one of those words that my tongue won't bend right. So, popular sovereignty, depending upon the vote of the state legislature. As you might imagine, even though most people in the state of Missouri were non-slaveholders, it was still a slave state, and most of the people in the state of Missouri were kind of sympathetic towards slavery. I won't deny that. Okay. Now, here's the only thing that changed about this. When they were surveying the southern border, the 3630 line, there was a little section down in the southeastern edge of Missouri that we now know as the Boot Heel, which was added into the state. Now, there's all sorts of stories about how this happened. The general story is that there was a very wealthy landowner, a man by the name of Walker, that owned a lot of land down in Penobscot County, and that he desired to be part of Missouri. He did not want to be in Arkansas for whatever reason. And so he petitioned the state. He worked behind the scenes. I suspect, knowing how politics worked during this period of time, there was some money exchanged. I almost bet that there was some bribes going on. And sure enough, when the survey map came out, this little section in the southeast corner of Missouri, we now know as the Boot Heel, was added into the state of Missouri. I don't imagine the Arkansas territorial government had a lot to do about that, and they probably weren't very happy about it, but nevertheless, it happened. There's all sorts of other stories about how this happened. There's a story that the people in this area petitioned the state and didn't want to be part of Arkansas because they said there were too many panthers and cottonmouths in Arkansas. They didn't want to be part of it. There's even a story that there was the surveyor had a girlfriend that lived south of this line, and he wanted her to be part of Missouri since he was a Missourian himself. So he kind of finagled the line to let it in. like I said, I'm sure probably this story there was just a lot of political pressure and probably some money exchanged hands to let the boot heel in. But here's the map then. So after the Missouri Compromise, here's what you've got in 1820. You've got all these areas here, which were already states. The ones in orange were already states. Up here is the Michigan territory. It will be let in as a free state eventually. Down here, you've got the Arkansas territory. You've also got Florida down here. These are not yet states. And so they will be let in as slave states. All this area here, which was controlled by the United States, that's part of the Louisiana Purchase, would come in as free states. This, of course, was all Spanish territory. And so, we really had no idea at that point that eventually this was all going to become American territory. And when it did, then that's going to cause another whole set of problems, because again, that's going to spark the whole debate about slavery all over again, particularly when it came to admitting Texas into the Union, since it was so big. So that's the Missouri Compromise. Missouri got to be admitted in, and they were kind of a choice all their own. They got to decide if they wanted to come in as a slave state and a free state. And the vote was taken, and sure enough, they voted to come in as a slave state. So it was the only slave state north of the 3630-degree parallel line. That's really important, folks. Okay, that's really an important area that you have to understand. I'm talking about new states at this point. Some of these over here, like Kentucky and Virginia, which included parts of West Virginia at that point, they're still slave states. Even Delaware was still a slave state, and Maryland. But at this point, the only state north of 3630 line after this compromise that could be admitted in as a slave state was Missouri. Kind of stuck up like a big sore thumb there, as you can see. Okay, so the man that crafted this compromise was a man by the name of Henry Clay. Henry Clay was probably during the 1820s and 30s and 40s, was probably the premier politician in the United States. He ran for president 3 different times. Probably should have been president. He was really a good politician. He was a good man. He was a moderate. A lot of people felt like he was not really fairly given his due. There was some little bit of controversies about some of the elections that he was involved in, and a lot of people felt like he should have been a president at some time or the other. But he's the man that crafted this compromise. His nickname was the Great Compromiser. Makes sense, right? Okay, Missourian immediately then set about. So now the Congress has said, okay, you can come in as a state. What's next? Well, the next step, according to the Northwest Ordinance, was Missouri had to craft a new state constitution, which had to be approved by Congress. Now, you can already tell there's going to be problems here again. So they set about writing a new constitution. Here's the problem. Who controls the convention? The pro-slavery delegates. Again, Missouri was made up primarily of non-slaveholders, but they were sympathetic to the slavery issue. They felt like if people had slaves, they ought to have been able to keep them. And since these people were kind of the wealthy people in the state, they were the ones that kind of got elected because they had the money. And, they end up being the ones that primarily wrote the new Constitution. They inserted a phrase in their new Constitution. It said, free blacks would never be allowed to enter into the state. Now, that was just, something that wasn't going to happen. That was nothing. That was something that the other states, the abolitionist states, were never going to allow to happen, because these people were free blacks, and they felt like if they had a choice to move about the Union, just like anybody else. So, on complicating the problem was the fact that unlike every other proposed state constitution, the people of Missouri did not get to vote on it. The state convention decided they would just present it to the Congress without a vote of the people. Now, I don't know if it would have changed. I really don't know if the people in the state of Missouri would have not voted for this Constitution. Because, like I said, even though most people in the state of Missouri weren't slaveholders, again, they were sympathetic to slaveholders. They felt like that was constitutionally protected right at that time. Well, the abolitionist movement absolutely said there is no way we're going to accept this Constitution. So, yeah, Missouri has been admitted into the Union pursuant upon writing a state constitution. So it looked like, once again, this was going to be a denial. I don't know what would have happened if they would have had a denial. I'm really not for sure, because at this time, 4 times is almost, 3 strikes and you're out. 4 times is a bad deal. Henry Clay stepped in again and he said, hey, we've got to get this settled. So he came up with what's known as the Second Missouri Compromise. Most people don't realize there were 2 Missouri compromises. The first one in 1819, 1820, and then this one. He proposed that Missouri's Constitution be altered to allow any U.S. citizen the right to move to the new state at any future time. Now, that's really key. His language was any U.S. citizen. Blacks, even free blacks, were not considered citizens. So the Missourians thought there is no way that blacks are ever going to be citizens. No way slaves are ever going to become citizens. So that's okay. By saying no U.S. citizen has a right to move to the new state, that was in a sense kind of throwing a bone to the abolitionists and kind of throwing a bone to the slavery people in Missouri. So the result was that the abolitionists said, okay, we can buy this. This was going to come back, folks, to haunt this country really bad in the 1850s. And we'll get to that when we get to the Civil War. Finally, August 10th, 1821, President James Monroe signed the Admission Act, and Missouri became the newest state in the United States. So it took basically 3-4 years for Missouri to be admitted into the Union. No other state had this much problem, except maybe Texas. Texas had a lot of problems too, getting into the Union. So here's Missouri in 1821. This is no map that I was able to find. And you can see we got the Boot Hill already. And down here is New Madrid County. And then we got Cape Girardeau up here, St. Louis. And we've got Franklin County, Jefferson County, Washington County, all these big counties out here. Look at this, folks. This is all 2 counties. This one was attached to Cascade County. This was what was called Wayne County. And this one had not even been incorporated as part of a county yet. It eventually would become Greene County. And I'll show you a map of that a little bit later when we get to that area. But this is basically, you can see the Ozarks is still basically uninhabited, except for a few hundred people. There's not a lot of people out here. Most of the people are around the Mississippi and the Missouri River Valley. There's some up here. There's some over in this area right south of the Missouri in the Osage River Valley. But this area down here is just basically, for all practical purposes, lacking in population totally. So here's a portrait of Henry Clay. That's an original photograph. There's not too many photographs of people back from this period of time, but that was the great compromiser, the man that was responsible for letting Missouri into the Union. So now Missouri is now a state. Boy, did that open the doors. All of a sudden, people just come swarming into the state. Like I told you a few minutes ago, within 10 years, the population of Missouri went from 66,000 in 1820 to 144,000 in 1830. It more than doubled within 10 years. It tripled. It doubled again within 10 years. It doubled again within 10 years. So by the Civil War, there was over 1,200,000 people in the state of Missouri. I mean, it just exploded. It was one of the fastest growing areas in the United States at this period of time. Why? Well, we went into that a little bit last week. The fact that it was allowed slaves, and so all the people in the Northwest Territories that had slaves were trying to get out of there. That came to Missouri. It was also land that was pretty empty, particularly the Ozarks, and so people wanted to come in because there was free land in a sense. The veterans of the War of 1812 and Revolutionary War came in because they were given land grants. The New Madrid earthquake prompted migration into the Ozarks because, as we saw last week, they were granted kind of the first emergency act that let them come in and gave them land. So people began to swarm into the Ozarks. They were almost not 100%, but I'd say 75 to 80% Scotch-Irish. So that's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes, is the Scotch-Irish. I've alluded to the Scotch-Irish quite a bit while we've been talking about the Ozarks and the history of Missouri. I'm going to really get into it right now for about 10 minutes or so and kind of show you what the Scotch-Irish are. So the vast majority of the new settlers into the Ozarks were Scots-Irish. They used to be called Scotch-Irish. And, we have to be politically correct now because the Irish are kind of noted for their drink. And people got offended because they were saying that they were Scotch-Irish because they like to drink. So we now call them Scots-Irish. I grew up hearing that I was a Scotch-Irish. So I don't know. Most of them were descendants from the upland South, the states of Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Carolinas. These areas were the ones that fueled the immigration into Missouri. They were very rugged people. These were frontiersmen. These Scots-Irish were noted for their independence, their restlessness. They were mistrustful of authority. They were extremely self-reliant and extremely brave. They were absolutely made for the rugged Ozarks. I'm telling you, they were just absolutely carved out for the Ozarks. Now, how did we get the Scots-Irish? Well, the Scots-Irish had originally been forced to move to what was called the Ulster Plantation of Ireland from their native lowland Scotland region in the 1600s. King James decided he wanted to tame the Irish, and he thought that the only people that were crazier and wilder than the Irish were the Scots. So he got up this whole idea that he was going to move a bunch of the southern Scots, the lowland Scots, over to northern parts of Ireland to tame the Irish. Well, it didn't work. Number one, they didn't tame the Irish. Number two, the Scots, all they did was fight amongst each other and with the Irish. So it didn't work, as it turns out. One of the reasons was the Scots were fiercely Protestant. Remember, this is an area where the Protestant Reformation took hold really rapidly. People like John Knox and some of these people like this, and they clashed with the Irish. The Irish were almost 100% Catholic. And, that's where you get into this whole Catholic Irish mistrust of each other. Okay. Eventually, though, the Scots did begin to blend in with the Irish, and they kind of had they would intermarry some, and they begin to kind of develop their own separate little culture, which became known as the Scots-Irish culture. And then they began to immigrate in vast numbers in the 18th and 19th centuries to the United States. There were reasons for this. Famine. They got tired of the English government because the English government was not fulfilling some of the promises they'd made to them. And of course, obviously, they didn't get along with the Irish. So they began to immigrate to the United States. The problem was they didn't fit in with the United States either, because these Scotch-Irish got to the United States. The Germans didn't like them. The New Englanders didn't like them. There were not very many places that they were welcomed in the United States. One of the places that seemed to welcome them more than others was Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania was primarily run by the Quakers. The Quakers had this idea of religious toleration. So that's where most of the original Scots-Irish ended up, was the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area. Eventually, the Quakers even got tired of them. So they began to move out into what we now know as Appalachia. And then from that point, they begin to move in to areas like the Ozarks and Arkansas in that area. So I've got a little film here, about 4 minutes long. It kind of talks about the Scots-Irish, and I thought you might enjoy it. So let's kind of look at this real fast here.
Fierce and independent, the toughness of the mountain men was bred in the bone. Most Appalachian hill folk can trace their kin back 1,000 years to the mountains and moors of Scotland, where fending off the harsh environment and armies of foreign invaders was a way of life and death.
The lowlands of southern Scotland, a region of rocky hills and poor soil along the border with England. From 1400 to 1600, it was a bloody war zone. The English invaded repeatedly, trying to bring the independent Scots under their direct rule. The lowlanders, farmers and warriors bound together in tight-knit clans, fought back, refusing to bow to foreign authority. This struggle to survive forged a fiery, resilient culture.
It was formed at the clan level, the local level. Part of it was the topography, which is not that different than what you see in the Appalachian Mountains today. And it was formed by constant struggle.
This endless cycle of violence went on for centuries. Finally, in 1610, King James I of Britain devised a plan to deal with the Scottish border folk. He gave them farmland in Northern Ireland, where they could fight instead with Britain's troublesome Irish population. But a century later, life was no better for these folks, now known as Scots-Irish for the addition of their adopted home turf. They were still fighting with the Irish over land, and they felt alienated and embittered toward Britain. They were ready to pull up roots.
And they were pretty rough-hewn by then, used to being displaced. They were no longer completely Scottish after generations. And they weren't integrated with the Irish because the indigenous Irish were their enemies.
Famine and crop failures in Northern Ireland sparked a mass exodus to the New World between 1720 and 1775. More than 250,000 Scots-Irish crossed the Atlantic. Most arrived in Philadelphia or other Delaware River ports. The poor and uneducated arrivals were met with a chilly reception by the English, Dutch, and German settlers. In their view, the Scots-Irish were nothing better than a rowdy, uncouth horde. Shunned by established colonial society, the immigrants set out for the backcountry. By 1754, they were pushing deeper into the Appalachian wilderness, America's western frontier, than any settlers had before. But the land they claimed had inhabitants, the Iroquois and Cherokee, who didn't take kindly to the aggressive newcomers. The settlers didn't have much choice but to fight. The battles continued over 20 long years, and the settlers would become experts in Indian fighting tactics, learning well how to blend seamlessly into their surroundings and sneak up on their foes. After thousands of deaths on both sides, the mountain men finally won their backwoods real estate. They were now masters of the wilderness, transformed from Scots-Irish immigrants into hardcore Americans.
Okay, so that gives you a little bit of idea about the makeup of these Scots-Irish. Now, who were some of these Scots-Irish? Well, I've told you already some of my relatives that came over that were Scots-Irish, but there were a lot of people that are a lot more famous than my relatives. Probably the most famous Scots-Irish immigrant into Missouri was Daniel Boone. Now, most of us, when we think of Daniel Boone, we think of Kentucky. You know, that's where Daniel Boone got his, that's where he became famous. And he most certainly did. He had settled in the backwoods of the Kentucky Territory in the late 1700s, but he didn't exactly get along well with the Kentucky government. He felt like he was being treated unfairly because he felt like the government was not paying him some of the things that they needed to pay him because of his service to the state and the territory. He also lost some land claims, which he felt like he had was owed. The result was by the late 1700s, Daniel Boone was tired of Kentucky, and he decided he was going to move west into Missouri. And that's exactly what he did. He moved into Missouri in 1798 when it was still a Spanish possession. He actually left the United States and moved into what was then Spanish Missouri. Settled along an area along the Missouri River near present-day Defiance. I know some of you up in the St. Louis area, particularly those in St. Charles, are very familiar with this. It's an area that became known as the Boone's Lick area. It was here that he lived the rest of his life. He built a big, large stone house, which is still there, been restored. He had salt works. That's how they made most of their money. And, you know, his sons, he had a large family, and they basically took up where their dad left off and became kind of outdoorsmen and frontiersmen themselves. And so this is where Daniel Boone lived for the rest of his life. It's a painting of Daniel Boone, and there's his house, which has been restored and still stands. Doesn't look like what you think about Daniel Boone. When you think of Daniel Boone, you think of a log cabin. He actually had a very large, nice house in Defiance. By the way, there's an old story about Daniel Boone that is told often in Missouri. It's probably not told as often in Kentucky. Daniel Boone, according to history, left in his will that under no circumstances was his body to be buried in Kentucky. Because by this time, Daniel Boone had kind of become famous when he died. And he lived to be a very old man. I think he was 89 when he died. And so he left word, he left it in his will. He said, my body, I'm to be buried in Missouri. And he was. The problem was, once later in later years, when the tourism idea popped up, Kentucky wanted him. And so they somehow finagled around and got his body disinterred and brought back and buried in Kentucky. And I've always said, knowing what I know about Daniel Boone, he's probably rolling over at 300 miles an hour right now in the state of Kentucky, because he made a vow one time he'd never step foot in the state again. He was so upset with them. I don't know, all you people back there in Kentucky that are listening, sorry, but that's the story that we get in Missouri. Now, one of his sons played a part in the opening up of the Ozarks. Nathan was one of his sons, and he was a chip off the old block. He was restless. He was independent. He was an Indian fighter. He absolutely just couldn't sit still. And so he got involved in a lot of things. He became a trapper, became a hunter. He was a surveyor who was involved with surveying the state when it was becoming, all the territory out there. And he helped build Fort Osage on the Missouri River. And he's the man that generally is regarded as one of the main forces in securing peace with the Osage. Remember, the Osage were the native inhabitants. And he actually had a lot to do with bringing the Osage to peace with the new residents of Missouri. He also led the Missouri militia during what was known as the Black Hawk War in the 1830s. And he was a great military man. Nathan Boone wasn't as famous as his father, but he may have done some of the things that his father did, and maybe even better than some of the things his father did. By 1837, he moved into the interior of the Ozarks into present-day Ash Grove. Ash Grove is in the northwest part of Greene County, about 20 miles or so from Springfield, Missouri, where I live. In 1837, folks, that was out in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing there. He built a walnut log cabin, which still stands. And you can go to that day and see his log cabin. I'll show you a picture of it here. Problem was, he wasn't home very often. He kept fighting Indians and kept surveying and kept leading the army clear up almost to his dying day in 1850. He was never home. But nevertheless, he did build this log cabin, which now has been restored. And this is Nathan Boone. This is a picture of him, one of the photographs of Nathan Boone. This is his cabin. Obviously, it's been sited, but it's been restored in Ash Grove, and you can go there and you can see it today. This is one of the oldest structures in the interior of the Ozarks today, is Nathan Boone's cabin. So, eventually, in the 1830s and 40s, the Ozarks begins to be settled. Now, it was slow, and we've already gone over some of those reasons. It was isolated, it was rugged, it didn't have a lot of natural resources. The rivers, although they were plentiful, they were kind of shallow, and you couldn't put a steamship up them for the most part. The land wasn't very good. And frankly, they didn't think of mineral resources. Come to find out, there was a whole bunch of lead in it, but that would come later. So what were some of the earliest settlements in the Ozarks? Well, here they are. Batesville in Arkansas, 1812, really early. Probably the earliest town in what we now know as the Ozarks was Warsaw. Warsaw was founded in 1826. Springfield was founded in 1830. Fayetteville, down in northwest Arkansas, again part of the Ozarks, 1837. Joplin was founded in 1841, but it never really got going big until the 1870s. And then Van Buren, down around Big Spring, in 1859. So you can see, this is a map kind of the area. You can see there's a whole lot of pretty good sized cities up in this area. There's not very many out here, folks. This is the Ozarks in the 1830s and 40s. And there were not very many towns in the Ozarks, with these exceptions of Joplin, Springfield, Van Buren, Batesville, Fayetteville, Warsaw. Other than that, there weren't a lot of towns in the Ozarks. There were some over here in the eastern part, but for the most part, this was still pretty isolated land, except for these rugged Scots-Irish that wanted to live by themselves. So next week, we are going to talk about the founding of Springfield. Springfield, of course, is the biggest town in the Ozarks, biggest city now. So it deserves our respect in terms of talking about it. And it has always been kind of the center of the Ozarks and still is today. So next week, we'll be talking about the oldest town in the Ozarks. That, by the way, is what's called the Day House on South Street in Springfield. That is the oldest brick house in Springfield, built in the 1850s, I believe. Okay, so thank you for being with me. Hope you've enjoyed it. And we still have a whole lot of rain and wind, thunder, and lightning going on, Rachel.
Well, there's no baby yet, so that's a good sign.
Thank heaven.
But thank you so much, Tony, and everybody for joining us.
Okay.
This will be up on YouTube later tonight, so thank you.
Will you be with us next week, or?
I should be. Well, actually, is next week Labor Day?
No, as a matter of fact, you're right. Next Monday
Yeah,
is
so-
Labor Day, so I won't be
So I
I'm gonna
might
take
not
that
see
day
you
off
for a
because I
while,
figured
Tony.
People got things they're probably spending some time with family, some people know. So
Yep.
I'm gonna take Monday off. Sorry about that. You're
Awesome.
right.
That's good. That's good. Well, until next time.
Okay, well,
Everybody have a
you may
great
have
one.
that baby by the next time.
Yep. All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.